so much for coming. This is a beautiful turnout. Thank you to Mary and Larry for doing this for us. We're really excited to talk about Henry Blatner today. If you're not familiar with the Pine Hollow Arboretum, we are a free public arboretum. You can come and tour the 22-acre property from dawn until dusk every day. And our founder, Dr. Buell, who raised his family in this house, some of his family is here, and so it's really wonderful to see some of the Blatner family and Mendelson family, I believe. And we're working on our own little Pine Hollow Historic District with all the Blatner houses on this road that we will see today. And I will give it over to Kara.
So I'm Kara Macri from Historic Albany Foundation, and I just want to thank all of you for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces who are repeat offenders of all of our programs. So thank you for continuing to come and support us. And welcome to all of those who I don't know, hopefully yet, and will know much better in the future. We are, for those that don't know, Historic Albany is kind of the City of Albany and Capital Region's historic preservation not-for-profit. Programming like this is a lot of what we do. So if you enjoy today and want to do more, there are membership forms and sign-ups for our email, so you can get, thankfully not spammed, but a once-a-week update with what else we have going on. So feel free to take one of those with you as you go. So to introduce Mary and Larry quickly, and then I'll let them take over, and after their talk, we're going to go walk over and tour the Buell's home, which I think at this point we're calling the Blatner house at this point.
Yeah.
Since they're really designed and lived in by Henry. And then we're going to be walking around the outside of the Stein's house. So just a reminder, these are people's homes, personal property. We're going to be very respectful as we walk through and around. But no, I don't need to remind any of you that. You've got that already. So Mary Valentis is joining us today for our conversation. I think we're calling it a conversation now instead of a lecture. It's way more fun that way. So Mary is the director of the Center for Humanities, Arts, and Technical Science at the University of Albany. She's a professor in English and Visual Studies, in addition to also being Henry's daughter. So she knows all the details there are to know. Larry Wilson is a principal at Mesick Cohen Wilson Baker, which is, I would say, one of the country's premier historic preservation firms. And they've done all sorts of amazing projects from Mount Vernon and Monticello, right? You've done like the most amazing sites in the country. And Mesick Cohen Wilson Baker's progenitor is Henry Blatner. So Larry will be able to share lots of early projects from the firm and some of the internal and more architectural stories for you. So I'll let the two of you take it away.
Thank you for being here, and some of my family's here, friends, and I think it's great that we're having a conversation instead of a lecture. And
that means I can interrupt you, right?
Absolutely, and so can anybody else. That's what my students do. I was trying to think of a way or what to call this conversation. And have many of you read Loving Frank, the novel? Well, I'm calling this Loving Hank, which was my father's nickname. And that novel was really about Frank Lloyd Wright's relationship with his final partner, or that's a good way to put it. And it was very tragic. But this one is going to, but the other thing was, I was thinking about the whole situation out of here in Pine Hollow Road. So I decided to call that Privilege, Pain, and Peyton Place. And I don't know if all of you know what Peyton Place was, but at the time it was a soap opera that everybody watched on a certain night. I think I started watching it in college, or high school, or something like that. And I say that because it was sort of like that, and I think my relatives will attest to that also. So I'll talk a little bit about my father, and then we can start talking about his education and all the different periods he went through. He was born in Albany, and his father was a trickster. He was Dennis, and he liked to play tricks on people. He was very short. His mother was very short, very bright, and very bossy, and she was a Sunday school teacher. And he went to the Mellon High School, and then he went on to the University of Pennsylvania. What was going on at the time?
Beaux-Arts.
Beaux-Arts. Do you all know what Beaux-Arts was, that whole movement? Do you want to talk about that? I don't mean to put you on the spot already, but
He was at University of Pennsylvania and then MIT.
Right.
And in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s.
Yes.
And that was very much cusp period, in the architectural world, particularly in Europe. But in America at the time, I believe his education would have been very grounded in the Beaux-Arts, which is classical tradition of classicism and learning Roman, Greek, Renaissance traditions and instituting them in modern architectural form, which we see all over the place. But it was very much cusp, international style was really coming in at that time. In the Bauhaus, particularly in Germany, and it came in a big way in the late 30s and in the 40s, and Henry's was in the middle of all that, right?
Yeah, well, I think that the Metropolitan Museum of Art is a perfect example of Beaux-Arts, which is, as you know, if you've been in those rooms, the rooms are very tall and it's magisterial, and you've got the Guggenheim across the street, which is modern architecture.
And MoMA, is
right, exactly.
International style.
And the University at Albany is the international style of modernism. Edward Durrell Stone. Were any of you here? I know you were, Carol. Were any of you here when we had all the architects from New York up and that we met Stone's son? And he came up and visited. So he was in the middle of all that. I would say that the Beaux-Arts you can see in this house more than any place else, because if you go look at the house next door, which was the house we grew up in, that was totally Frank Lloyd Wright, and it was the kind of organic architecture where the inside and the outside are it's kind of seamless transition. I mean, you can see in this house. You have the flagstone and you have his characteristic use of materials. Was this the original floor? Do you know? It looks like, no? Carpet, yeah. But was this underneath it? Yeah, okay. But I think the period he went into with the modern architecture was the use of natural materials and a lot of brick and a lot of flagstone. And
I think that when I look at these three houses, they really reflect that transition that was happening in the world, let alone here. And it's a beautiful reflection of that. And as you point out, this house would be the most grounded in his education, probably the Beaux-Arts. It's the most traditional of all the houses. You get these Blechin moldings on this is a very, federal Georgian kind of thing going on here, as is most of the moldings that are around doors and that kind of thing. But then you get things like in this office here, you get corner windows. They're divided light, like a traditional window, but they're stuck into a corner like Frank Lloyd Wright liked to do with glass in the corners. Well, Henry took two windows and put it right in the corner, which is very not classical. Classicism is, composed and put the windows, symmetrically in a room, and everything is very, very composed and symmetrical. And so it's as if he had two ideas going at the same time. I suspect the client here, and you would know, was having some influence that they want some traditional aspects to, and that's the struggle architects always have, is the client. The client wants what the client wants, and the architect says what the architect wants. So it's kind of a dichotomy in this building more than any. I think you see that duality going on. Even like these curves on the walls, they're very non-classical.
And Deco-ish.
Art Deco. And you see the Deco also down on the Steinhaus. The porch over the garage has got these sort of big, heavy horizontal banding instead of the balusters like you normally get in the classicism. So, he was really torn between his education and the times, and
Because
what was
he's
happening.
very much into the modern.
I suspect, I never
That was
met Henry Blatner.
Right.
So I've been with the firm since 1984. That's 40 years, and but his name and his influence is all over our firm, even 40 years later. But I never met him, so I can't speak literally and personally to Henry Blatner.
Well, I have to tell you a family story, though. Do you know? I don't know the number of the house. It's on Thurlow Terrace.
Good.
We had an uncle who was part of the Mendelssohn family, and he wanted to build a house on Thurlow Terrace, and it is now the what is it? The hotel, the art.
The artist.
Yes. Well, he had first asked Frank Lloyd Wright to come to Albany. Frank Lloyd Wright got on a train and came from Chicago to Albany, and he met with the Mendelssohn family. What was it? Was it Sam or it was Sam who was going to build this
It
house?
was a great uncle.
Great uncle, right? And he met with him, and they rejected his design.
With all due respect to Henry, that's too bad.
Yeah, right. I mean, it was just.
Having a Wright building in the middle of Albany would be cool.
Yes, and I've seen the plans for it. Jim Cohen showed me the plans, and the plans have been published in a journal in, I think it's in Japan. And the house had a very Japanese of look. It wasn't a falling water look, but it was just an incredibly unique place. And I'm so sorry that you said apparently a couple of descendants of Frank Lloyd Wright have designed houses in Albany, and there are a couple in Loudonville. We're supposed to have a salon out there, and that'll be interesting too. I wanted to mention because I'm an English professor, I love visual studies. But if you want to get a sense of the times and what it was like growing up during this 60s and 70s period, watch Ange Lee's film, The Ice Storm. Have any of you ever seen it? It is incredibly, it includes architecture. It's Philip Johnson's architecture from the Connecticut suburbs. And all those beautiful white houses of Philip Johnson. And then it has the Key Party, that was a huge part of 70s culture, where everybody would arrive at a party, throw the keys in the dish, and then you go, And the other thing was the idea of children having to be their own parents and switching that whole kind of situation. And it stood up very, very well. It came out in 1997, I think, and it's worth watching. It's
Sigourney Weaver.
It was Sigourney Weaver and Kevin Kline. It's just so classic, and the architecture in there is wonderful. The other thing I would suggest that you do is read John Updike and maybe John Cheever, because it was that kind of feeling about the houses here, and the positioning of the houses that was part of the whole milieu out in Pine Hollow Road. And that's why I say privilege. I mean, it was a privilege to live in these houses also.
Well, I suspect that Henry had it his way, he would have had more of the Blatner organic, so that's a very organic kind of design aesthetic that the Blatner house has.
Yeah, that's a picture of our house.
Right after it was born, and after it was built. And
That was before the addition was put on. There was an addition that was put on later.
Because this house was published in 1948, I think it was. Here it is, if you could hold it. Here's the edition, I think Mary was talking about. And House and Garden, May 1949. And, his work was published. We have several of them in this slideshow in different publications, House and Garden, and a couple others at the time. And he was recognized for these houses that he was doing. But this, I think, has got to be obviously, it was his own house. So this was where his heart was, right?
And you'll see when we go over there, the use of the brick. And unfortunately, I shouldn't say this way, but there was Heidelberg stone, that very rough stone, and they painted it over, I believe.
Around the base.
No, on a whole wall. We had a playroom with a wall of stone, Heidelberg stone.
That was pretty.
And it's painted over, but I'm not saying it.
And just the notion of taking the landscape and bringing it in and out with the big windows. I mean, that's all very Wrightian, very organic, very, I almost want to say American in a way.
And it was cedar. And then he also designed furniture. So a lot of the furniture in the house, I don't know if it's still there, it was built in.
You have some drawings to your dining room over in the room there.
He also designed a couple of houses in Woodstock, and I don't know if you have pictures of those.
Again, house and home. And this is an article about how you build small open plan houses. This has nothing anymore to do with Beaux-Arts.
Do you know the house across the street, though?
You mentioned
Go on.
that one. Yeah.
Did you know what they did? They put a house on top of it.
Yeah. Done. When I was in it.
They built a very conventional, traditional house on top of it. It's gone, but that house was just.
Yeah.
The apartment son's house.
Yeah, the apartment house. I mean, it's worth going through these slides a little and discussing them.
That's Colony Country Club.
Colony Country Club, which is 1965, 6, 7?
7.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful expression of a sort of Scandinavian modern, I want to say. And
It was, but I think he was very influenced by Mies van der Rohe. We would go to New York and every month, and he would get a haircut. He would have he would go to Frank Brothers or Brooks Brothers or whatever, and he did drive around in a Rolls Royce because he said it was cheaper to do that and change your car every, I don't know, 20 years or something like that. But we had to go get the Rolls Royce fixed too. And but he would point out all the buildings in New York City, and on the way to school too. And his favorite building was Lever House, the Philip Johnson building. But he also loved the Seagram's building, which was Mies van der Rohe. And when I look at the houses in Connecticut in these films and those white houses that are very stylish, that was when you say Scandinavian.
well,
I think it was
in
German.
my mind, like the Colony Country Club is much more free and organic, more in the writing, but also devoid of all of the the natural material aesthetic. It's white and it's much more of a Scandinavian modern in my mind.
I would say it's
Whereas-
postmodern. Am I wrong?
No.
Postmodern.
I wouldn't.
In a certain way, because it combines. I mean, postmodern to me, it combines everything, together in terms of fusion. But that's in literature and that's in philosophy.
Well, postmodern in my world is architecture that's referential, and it's a mannerism. It's a use of
Yeah,
historical period and styles
Right.
in an ironic, but usually
Sort of garish.
Well, Gary, yes, puts in that. But this to me, it could be Eero Saarinen or
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
It doesn't have the Frank Lloyd Wright, fussiness about little details of pattern, and it's to me it's Eero Saarinen or
You're right. Absolutely.
and it's beautiful that way. But it's not Mies either. Mies was very classical. I mean, he was almost translated Beaux-Arts into a classicism. I mean, into modernism, where things are very ordered and symmetrical. They may have been tectonically modern, but it was all very, very controlled. And whereas this is just like the landscape, it just blends in with the contours, and I think that's just a beautiful.
It is beautiful.
Beautiful piece. I think that was a real collaboration too, maybe with John Mesick.
Oh, yeah.
The two of them worked on this together.
And my
If I'm
mother.
not mistaken. Right? I didn't know that. Okay.
Well, she was a very well-known golfer,
Right?
and they planned, and he had an obsession with golf, and so he went to Pebble Beach, and they went to Scotland, right? Scotland, and he went to see the courses in Europe and all that. And when they went on their honeymoon, they went to Hershey, Pennsylvania to play golf. And they planned, this honeymoon around golf. And so actually that was one of the nicest things that they ever did together. But
Well, you don't know all the things they did together.
no, I don't, thank goodness.
One thing I want to say about the other thing about the country club, because I'm kind of, interestingly, my very first job in the world, at 14 years old, was working on the grounds of the Colony Country Club, because I grew up in Voorheesville. But so I'm very familiar with this. And then I ended up washing dishes, I want to say, when I was 14 and a half, or whatever. It's near and dear to me. But I know the building, and I know, I didn't know Henry, but I know John Mesick. I was partner for 25 years with him, and he talked a lot about the country club too. And I know that, the whole concept of this was to span its wings out into the landscape and the contours. And a really important part of this whole building was its relationship to the golf course, as it was a country club. And the approach was the circuitous, gentle drive up to the building, which has been obliterated. I don't know if you're aware of it, but they've completely obliterated the whole approach and made a straight-on axial approach. They put a bunch of houses. I know I'm probably offending some of those here. But the whole concept of the approach, the site, the building, the approach was all really important. I know that, and I don't think the more contemporary owners and operators of the facility have appreciated that. And more money drove the issue, and they wanted to sell the lots for.
no, I think that's absolutely right. It makes a total difference.
Yeah. I mean, it just was that to me was just a great.
So you had the course on the left and this sort of grove of trees.
On the right, and you approach it from different angles as you come up that circuitous drive, and you come around kind of the side, and then it was a great thing. And it still is, but I think you lost part of its greatness in the approach.
He was very conscious of approaching buildings, particularly, I don't know if any of you have seen the temple in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. You have. And what was interesting about it is that he also was very interested in symbolism. So that particular building, but the temple, which got an award from, I don't know.
But organization in Israel,
Right.
the top 10 temples in the world.
Right. Yeah. And the thank you, Tony. And the whole thing was he wanted to replicate Moses's journey up the mountain. So that's the whole. He put boulders. Going up to the temple, which was supposed to replicate Mount Sinai.
And it had big masses, right?
And big tablets right up there.
Almost, yeah.
Yeah.
And a big mass that you came up
Yeah.
like you were climbing a mountain.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's still there.
Yes. It's over there, right? Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember the name of the temple, though. He was furious that he was not picked to do FMS. So he didn't go there to be buried. He didn't go there when I got married. I'm sort of giving a flavor of who he was not a very angry. I mean, he could be angry, but he was, he had a healthy sense of himself. Yeah, which is good. I mean,
Bethlehem.
I'm
Good to say personal.
someone from New York. They had two architects who were members of the temple, Einhorn and my father, and they didn't pick either one. So they picked a guy from New York,
Edwin
and
Percival, something like that.
is that what it was?
Yeah, from New York, and
Yeah.
did that.
I look at that out my kitchen window. I love that temple.
Yeah, it's got some really nice stained glass.
So when it's lit up,
Yeah,
it's
wonderful.
yeah.
She didn't like it. This,
He did this, which is really, again, to me, gets back to that Scandinavian mid-century modern aesthetic of
Yeah.
white against contrast against the landscape. Unlike Frank Lloyd Wright, that would make it organic materials blend with the landscape, but this was an object on the landscape.
this is more poetry in a certain way. I mean, it's very poetic.
Well, it's setting with it. I don't know what it was when it was first built, but I love the relationship of the trees, the trunks of the trees to the columns.
And, yeah, right, all the trees.
It all kind of,
Yeah.
there's nature and then there's man, and
Yeah.
there's this relationship. And this is really very international style, stripped down of ornamentation, white, just the forms being expressed in contrast to the environment, but poetically related to it, I guess is the way.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, yeah.
Unlike Frank Lloyd, or unlike the Blatner house, which is not this at all. I mean, that's the thing I find about Henry is, I mean, he wasn't stuck in a single idiom or he wasn't dogmatic. I mean, he really seemed to.
Well, he reinvented himself, I think, which
I think
is
that,
really cool.
Yeah. Or responded to the program and the client at hand,
Yeah,
And like most of us who design and architects, again, we have to deal with a site, we have to deal with budgets, we have to deal with people, clients, they're.
you have to be a psychologist.
You have to be a psychologist, you have to be everything. And so all these influences dictate what you do. And he obviously was responsive to different demands that were on him. And he was educated in this Beaux-Arts tradition, so he could do this. But then he's got this other, side of him pulling at this time the modernist and so there's a lot of dichotomy going on in his mind, I think, in these different projects. But he successfully pulled it off in different ways,
There's a library at the medical college. I don't know if any of you see that.
Do we have that in here?
Do we have that one?
He's like, comment.
That's the Clarksville.
That's the famous.
That's early, and that was published as well. And
It's on the National Register.
it was acclaimed largely because he was working here on developing really interesting. I don't think there's a section in here. Maybe there is, but the way he used skylights and brought light into the space is what he was really focused on, and what he got the acclaim for. It's hard to see it up here, but above here, there's this sort of there's this clear story windows, and not skylights. They're clear story windows, so they're high windows, and they're above the classrooms, and light came all into the back, and so the classrooms had a lot of natural light in it, and that was really what was innovated about this particular project, and what got it published to a large degree was that the way he was thinking of light and the importance of light on education, learning, and kids, and that seemed to be the focus.
And that's true in the Girls Academy building.
I don't know that as well, but
You have,
we have pictures of it. I'm not. Yeah,
well, he built that.
and there's Beth Emeth, right?
Right. The Girls Academy was built on the idea of a lyceum, the Greek shape, and there was a courtyard in between, and all the floors in the Girls Academy were brick, and the walls were teak, and so that was sort of the
A lot of glass onto the Lyceum, the courtyard area.
yes, and yeah, exactly,
Yeah, those great portico walkways.
yeah, long walkways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the courtyard in the middle. And,
Yeah.
Well, I think that, again, here is using big shed roofs and then flat roofs, and there's nothing here that speaks. It's interesting. This is not international style. It's not Beaux-Arts. It's what would you call this? Contemporary, I would say. The big shed roofs, almost referencing to some degree residential. I mean, the big gabled roofs and big overhangs, and I would say it's a contemporary style as much as anything.
Yeah.
The international style, some of the other like
The university is international style.
Yeah, and the Presbyterian Church kind
Yeah,
of thing,
right.
where you have flat roofs and, but
Yeah.
this is much more of a domestic approach, contemporary domestic approach to, which is a whole nother, but I think there was a lot of economy here too.
Yeah.
It was driven largely, to a large extent, by budgets.
And then there was the Pink Palace.
Yeah, the Pink Palace, right. Yeah.
He built a dormitory at Skidmore and made it out of pink.
Why pink, Mary?
Gee,
Does anyone know why pink?
Girls Dormitory?
gender. Yeah, and they were furious, right? But the whole thing was a kind of disaster. It's gone.
It was pink and it was not welcome somehow.
Not well. It was before political correctness.
Right. Yeah. But they demolished that building.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Have to wipe out what. Yeah.
Well, every architect has its mistakes.
Right. Exactly.
Frank Lloyd Wright would say, just plant vines on it.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Doctors bury their mistakes. Architects plant vines on it.
That's right. Do you think we should go to questions, or?
Sure. I don't know what timing. We're just gabbing along here.
Yeah. Right.
You've actually got another 20 minutes to shower.
Right.
The Babbo place?
Oh, the Babbo plant. Just so quickly, yeah. I mean, I stuck this picture in here because it was out of the magazine form. And there's this great period picture of the woman in the refrigerator. It just speaks of the times. But Babbo, now that was a relative, right? Babbo was a relative?
Yeah.
Was that the Mendelssohn? Right. And this is in Chicago, right? This plant that he designed was
We
in
had
Chicago.
the Mendelssohn family had plants in Chicago, Albany, Los Angeles. Yeah.
Right.
And so he went out and did the factory in Chicago.
Now that's Mies. There's this Mies personality coming out.
Yeah.
It's this sort of international style, but it's Mies. It's a tectonic. It has these, all window systems, and it's very organized, and it had to be because it was a factory. But it's interesting. There's published with this was the plan of it. It's a factory, so it had to be, linear and organized and very, composed. And it has none of that free Scandinavian.
No, none of that.
Yeah,
No.
it was a factory.
Yeah.
And that is his international personality coming out.
But there was huge advertising campaign
Right.
with Babbo and Glim and all these products. And the family was very poor. And they developed these products by getting on a soapbox. Literally, that's where the term comes from, getting up on one soapbox and hawking the potash, the soap, in the street in Albany. And they packed it, and then it turned into this huge, business where, Babbo became a name like Ajax or whatever, so it became generic.
Where's the name come from?
Can we go back?
Babbo? Where's the name come from?
No,
But the name,
B.T. Babbitt. They bought a factory from the industrial.
Okay, so it came from another name, another family.
The industrialist, B.T. Babbitt. It's a book by Sinclair Lewis.
Is it? Okay.
yeah, yeah.
So that's where it comes from.
Yeah. But they all got together and they had a golf foursome every weekend. My father and the Mendelssohn
My father.
Right.
relatives.
Well, I just thought that was interesting
No,
because it showed another side of his architectural personality
He loved the Chicago architects. He used to talk about them on the way to school. Louis Sullivan.
Right, Sullivan. And,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
So,
On the tower.
Yeah, the South Wall. I mean, there's another part.
Oh,
of
yeah,
it.
right.
You know, the firm was hired with Harrison, by Harrison, or with Harrison,
With, yeah.
to plan and develop the plan for the Empire State Plaza in Albany. And, I mean, I got a lot of stories, heard stories from John Mesick, because I didn't know Henry, but I know he and they went to New York and spent time
With Rockefeller.
with Rockefeller and Harrison in Harrison's office in New York City, where they were planning, you know, the egg. And John was talking, you know, Rockefeller would, you know, want to, you know, the
He
way
was
they
moving
did it,
all the
moving
parts
the piece
around.
around, and got the egg, and you stuck it over here, and
Right.
you know, so I mean that's a major commission to be involved in. I mean, Harrison was really the architect, you know, a record for that. But
He was his cousin.
were they cousins?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Harrison?
And Rockefeller, yeah.
Oh, and Rockefeller,
Yeah,
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 but
yeah.
not Henry.
No, no.
I think you're saying. Yeah, Harrison and Rockefeller.
We'd like to.
But this goes a long way. I mean, this is part of the planning for the mall, as I understand it. This was to, a lot of the housing was being displaced by the mall, and there was a plan to build housing, you know, in this in 1964 or 5 was the ideal for housing, you know, and that's still there today. It's still, yeah.
Now,
So-
my question is, does it still have the colors on the floors? Do you know at night, have you seen that building at night where you have that building and
Bands of
each...
color, yeah.
Yeah, it's red and yellow and blue.
Right. Each floor had a different color.
Do you have the
I think so. I've
do you have the
seen that.
spectrum?
Oh, the spectrum. That's one of, now, he started the firm, or he was part of the firm with Vander Bogart in 1941. That seems to be when the firm started. And it was
Right.
Vander Bogart and Blatner
Right.
first. And that have lasted, I think they went, the war happened, they went off to Washington, part, but they did the spectrum together, right? And
Well, he owned the spectrum. It was in Delaware then.
Delaware, right.
And do you
But who
you
owned-
all know
who owned
those Art Deco designs? He designed that.
Do we have an the interior, the deco patterns
Yeah.
and stuff on that?
He
I mean, you
owned
can
it.
see his deco influences in the walls here, like these curved walls, and I say on the Stein house, you get these deco, the whole railing of the garage is this deco.
Right. In the house, our house in the middle, we had a dining room and we had a bar that he would just pull it back, the thing, and he drew a snake, a green snake with an apple, signifying temptation, of course. And so you opened the door and there was the bar. Because he had such an incredibly wry sense of design and combined with humor.
But you know, this is as early as
That's the early,
it's
yeah.
Art Deco into the sort of organic Wrightian to the international style to the, you know.
So you could say he was eclectic.
He was influenced by the times.
Yeah.
For sure. Interestingly, you know, he starts with the Beaux-Arts, and Vander Bogart, as I understand, was very much into historic buildings and I forgot, he was part of the preservation world in this area. And the firm eventually came around, and that's what we do mostly, you know, today is restore Beaux-Arts buildings and earlier. But it's funny to look at the history of the firm I've been involved with for 40 years and over a course of 80 years and see how it's followed the influences of the 20th century from traditional buildings through the modernists into the postmodern, and then for us back to the traditional restoration world. That's
Yeah.
been interesting. Other questions?
Could you share more about some of the residences that you designed?
I know he did two in Woodstock. And one was, I saw it, went by it, it was cantilevered out, like falling water. I could probably get the name if I looked very hard. He was very friendly with Fletcher Martin, the painter, who used to come to our house all the time. And Fletcher Martin did a lot of painting of boxers, fighters, and Mexican. So he did a couple of houses for artists in down in Woodstock. Here, I can tell you some of the houses. Do you know the Oppenheim house on Manning Boulevard? You do. And that was very Frank Lloyd Wright. That was Helderberg Stone, and it's right on Manning Boulevard, South Manning Boulevard, on the right as you're going towards Western Avenue.
It's between New Scotland and Western?
Yeah, and it's towards the latter part, and they really renovated it. I don't know who owns that house. And then there's the Brenner House, which is on Marion Avenue. He did about 4 houses on Marion Avenue. Those were sort of, I don't know, they were very mixed too.
Yeah, it's interesting that, back then in the 40s, 50s, 60s, it was more common for people to hire an architect to design them a house. The only houses we do now are, bankers from New York, because people don't have the resources, money generally anymore or desire, I guess, not always, but often it's more of a builder house or architects seem to be a luxury that a lot of people don't want to invest in. But somebody makes all those decisions, when they build a house.
Unless you're Beyonce or...
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. If you're an investment banker from New York, you can find a buck. But Henry did all these houses for regular folks like us.
Yeah, there are a couple on Front Grove Road. Just trying to think where else. Wits End, that was across the street.
Yeah, Frank Lloyd Wright did that too. He did hundreds of houses. Right. But it was interesting at the times that and we have a lot of Henry's drawings still in our office, the archives, and there's some of the houses, a couple of them, which I can think of one. It's a small cottage. We have the drawings for it. You might be interested in seeing those.
We're gonna come over.
Oh yeah. Right.
Well, he was a perfectionist in terms of his architecture. He was absolutely, he would go out to the site if something was wrong and it wasn't put in like a brick wall or something. If that wasn't done properly, he would have it taken down. And you worked at his office. This is my brother, and you worked at his office. Would you say that was accurate in terms of his?
Well, it was tumultuous. You get everybody involved in it, and everybody was coming from a different angle, and he was the guru.
The maestro. Yeah.
I think architects tend to take a bit of a sadistic. Take that wall down, damn it, see that brick's off.
And when it's your kid, too.
Yeah, yes.
My dad was a house designer builder, so I'm like, I'm sitting here going, I feel you. Nobody ended up working for him.
Can you say anything about the kitchens in a lot of these houses?
They're
Because
terrible.
They were just interesting that, in our times now, right, kitchens are the center of the whole house and
Well,
they're huge.
kitchen
And these
pornography.
kitchens were very small. My understanding was that it was because it was actually a maid or a cook that did the cooking. And so they didn't.
Or a housewife.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get you to talk a little bit about.
Well, I was going to talk about that because this community here, it was, that's when I said privileged. because you all had a couple who lived in your house, and there were nurses, there were cooks, there were ironing ladies,
Chauffeurs,
a chauffeur, right?
Landscaper.
lots of landscapers.
Yeah, yes, and snowplower. I mean, there was a lot of staff. Let's put it that way. And some of our best friends are still, the people who worked in this whole, and the three houses. We all had people who helped, and
So there was.
so the kitchen was not the purview.
Right.
I mean, Mrs. Stein, Lucy Stein, in the first house was a great cook. And our mother was a great cook, actually. But she had help. And I think your family had your father was an amazing cook. So food was an obsession. Let me put it that way, but the kitchens were very small.
And separated, right? It's separated from the living, whereas today it's inverted.
No, today it's sort of the center of the whole thing. And if you look at film, the kitchen porn of Betsy Myers, I think her name is, there's all this kitchen stuff in houses, and it's the envy of a lot of people. But I think there was less status, if you didn't have a Sub-Zero, people were not concerned with those kinds of labels.
Well, they were tucked away, right?
Yeah.
Whereas now, when you're showing it off, it's like you're showing off your
Yeah, I mean, if you have a dishwasher, it's got to have a certain cachet.
Yeah, exactly.
But then it was, you're right. It was not up
Wasn't
for.
the big thing in the 50s that Ronald Reagan and the GE kitchens, wasn't that when it began? That's what I remember in terms of early television and early exercising. That was the thing, and probably before that. Because I know the house we moved into in Albany, that tiny kitchen, kitchen was an afterthought, kind of. The refrigerator was out in the hallway.
Right, yeah.
But your kitchen was tiny in your house.
Oh, yeah,
It
yeah,
was really tiny.
yeah.
Well, and you'll see in this kitchen, it was a kind of a narrow galley kitchen, and it's a bump out now that was the addition to make the kitchen more livable
usable.
and a place for the family to gather.
Yeah, but isn't that interesting sociologically?
Totally.
It really is.
I think the open kitchen is much more helpful.
The Blatner original, your house, that's where the renovations have been. Where they
Like,
bumped out things and
Right.
Yeah.
And I know
Knock down walls.
Betty Nathan did, a huge renovation.
Yeah.
What about the steps? Everything he built had steps that were dangerous. So when you go into the house, be careful.
Yeah, but that's what really makes architecture, can hear.
Yeah, do it.
It's what makes architecture more dynamic, I guess. If you're just walking a straight platform, whereas if rooms, expand and contract with space, it makes it much more interesting.
And
I know it's dangerous, yes,
Yeah.
but just don't drink too much when you come to the house. Yeah, oh yeah.
But have they had to add handrails? They're like, what do you have there? Like,
I suspect so, but I haven't been inside that since I was washing dishes.
it's because I'm teaching like commercial design. And one of the things I'm looking at it going, yeah, that wouldn't pass now. But I mean, again,
Yes,
you
you're
have
right.
the same conversation of the levels make it interesting. Sure.
And that was very much in period.
Well, the closets were small too.
yes,
That's, that was so interesting that the closets were very small. You didn't have a closet person coming, what is that?
Oh, California closets.
Yeah.
But what about these little houses? They probably had an open kitchen. I could look at the plans, but they were very open plans. And I suspect those are open kitchen. Sociologically, I think the open kitchen is the best thing that ever happened to human beings, really. It brings, quote, the wife out of the kitchen, the family together, and, everybody's cooking instead of a person. It's sociologically much better.
sometimes.
This has nothing to do with Henry, but.
Yeah, but that it's a very interesting observation about the kitchen, and I think it says something about the family too. I mean, it says something about the sociology of the family. So do you take that into consideration when you're designing a house? You know, do you talk to them about all these aspects of? And you don't do that many houses, but
We do houses, and yes, there's a lot of conversation, and clients, as I said earlier, are very influential on these things. I mean, you can't ignore. You could try to be persuasive and convey things, but clients have usually no better than architects. But yes, those are, and almost always the kitchen is now central to the social environment of it's just the way it's just almost universal at this point.
yeah, Barbara.
Yeah, what is the building that he designed in, I think it's on Washington, it's at the side of a hill, that he won an award for. And I remember that it's middle or low income housing that he wanted everyone or the upper floors to be able to see the Helderberg.
Oh, you know where that is? On Central Avenue. It's on Central Avenue and Northern Boulevard.
Right, yeah, and I just like, he did, he had that consciousness on wanting people's, is it round? No, it sounds.
No, you know where, it's on Central and Northern Boulevard, and it goes way up, and I think it's now not an apartment house, I think it might be.
I'm not. But I remember it was really challenging because it was on the side of the
Townsend,
and I was like, really wanted to
be able to see the Helderbergs. And that's such an interesting, notion that he did a lot with low-income housing. And was very conscious of people being able to learn from the building and to learn from the environment.
What's amazing, and somebody brought it up to me, was that it was kind of the times. I mean, architectural firms coming out of the 40s, 50s after the war, they weren't as big. There tended to be smaller firms. And now, the sort of corporate architecture where there's 800 people in a firm is what drives the field. But then there were smaller firms, and all the architects did everything. Who was I talking about this earlier? We were talking about that, right? Henry was probably at the drafting table doing the plumbing doings, and whatever. And that's where I came to. That's what it was like. Actually, when I started was drafting for one thing, but it was much more, a group of people collaborating to put out documents. And I can see even in these archive drawings that I have, there's a lot of small projects, quick commercial things, but then we have a roll of drawings from, I know it's in the archives, maybe a foot in diameter. There was the old Albany Medical College drawings, and there were, dozens and dozens and dozens of very complex drawings. So just in his small firm, and it was small, you're doing a shed house somewhere, but he's got a roll of, very complex, drawings for the Albany Medical College. So it was a pretty diverse, set of clients and documents that they were putting out for these things.
Oh yeah,
projects.
And part of the rhythm of having him work in the house was having a charrette. Do you all know what that? A charrette is a French word which meant the cart, where the architects brought the rolls of drawings, right?
But what it really means is you stay up all night and work hard.
Yeah, right. You stay up all night and you get that job done. But it comes from that French word.
Yeah, everybody collaborates, works together. It was a esprit de corps, I guess is we use the other term for that, where everybody's collaborating, working hard till the middle of the night. And that's a tradition that architecture comes from in college and schools. I don't know if that's commonly understood, but when I went to college and stay up all night, if you didn't earn your badge,
Yeah.
And it's this sort of it's purposeful. I mean, it's more than just a job. It's more than just a profession. It's a passion, and I didn't know Henry, but I have to believe he was bitten by that bug.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And charrette falls right into that concept where,
Yeah, but you knew when he was, at the end of it. And it was getting like doing a book, where you get
yeah.
the
Well, I'm afraid the younger generation, now that I'm getting old, I can say, I don't know, they have been quite that same level of passion.
I have a question for you. What is AI going to do to architecture?
Yeah.
It's like a boy, yeah. I don't know anything about AI. I don't know.
I mean, is AI going to,
It's going to design your building and build it and
Yeah, right.
cook your food for you and drive your car, right?
yeah, right. Yeah. No, it's true.
There are currently focuses that do that because where I teach, where we have to research that to stay up on it. The interesting thing is the most recent one I did with it, and it was for, I think, supposedly affordable housing, but it had horrible amounts of mistakes to it. So it's still, but in a matter of months, it could rectify that. So yeah, it's frightening and fascinating at the same time.
Oh, no, I know.
Find that with 3D printed buildings. I think they just completed one in Malaysia. And so you've gotten rid of human architects, human contractors, and pretty soon they'll just, put robots in there to live and cook. And,
I agree. The thing is, as I understand it with AI, it's nothing more than a reflection of human habits, right?
or an aggregate.
Aggregate is a better word for it, of human habits. So what happens when humans no longer have habits? The computer has the habit. So the computer is mimicking itself all of a sudden. And there's no more human, it's a scary dystopian picture out there.
We're developing a project for this summer, because I work with the AI people too, as a humanist. And they're trying to develop empathy in a robot. And that's the hardest thing that you can do. It's also hard for a psychopath to have empathy, but that's the project, is how do we program empathy?
It can mimic it, like this thing I was just describing to you about these emotions. It can
Yeah, that's the one
it can
that's the
mimic.
tricky one.
It can mimic, but it can't be, it's not real. And that's the scary part. It's not real emotion. It's a
It's a picture of emotion.
and
It's a
to me,
simulation.
That's kind of, I don't know. My kids and grandkids don't have to worry about it.
My students are writing wonderful papers with this stuff, and we have software.
We can recognize it.
We have software, we can pick it up immediately. So what do you do when the student has, if they don't, they can cite it. They can cite AI and say, I used AI for this paper. But when they don't, and you pick it up, is that total plagiarism?
F.
Yeah,
It's called F.
that's plagiarism. When you give them an B plus or something, it's very interesting what's going on.
Yeah.
I'm going to cut you off
We
real
gotta-
quick.
we gotta
This
go.
is
We have
a
couple
far
questions
deviation
and
from
then we're
Henry.
gonna go. One of the things I didn't want to let get away when we were planning this talk, one of the things that came up that I found fascinating but also very timely was you were talking about some of the anti-Semitism that a lot of architects at the time were facing, and you had talked a little bit about Henry's experiences at that time, and I think it's a really fascinating thing to touch on if we do have a few minutes to go there.
He and my mother, when he was in the Navy, he was stationed in Washington. And one of the things that he did was he would design officers' clubs, nice officers' clubs. And he would also replicate enemy planes. He would draw the planes and replicate the planes so that they could spot the planes. And they would go out in Washington, and they would go to a dinner party, and they could, and I'm putting this in quotes, they could pass. And in terms of passing, that meant that they didn't look Jewish. And so people didn't know whether you're Jewish or not or whatever. And they experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in the Navy. And he talked to me about that. I mean, he was his life was divided, and I haven't talked about this yet, but his life was divided into basically two kinds of women. Our mother, who was a humanist and a liberal and, Colony Country Club and all this kind of thing, and a great golfer. And then he married, his second marriage was to a descendant of John Marshall. And so it was a very waspy, Scholar Meadows kind of situation. And so there was, again, you talked about the bipolarity about his life. But his mother was a Sunday school teacher at Temple Beth Emeth, and in the end of his life, and he died very, my brother was there, he died with an aneurysm very suddenly when he was playing golf in Sea Island. And he was very young.
60s, right?
66, yeah. But before he died, he started going back to reading the Psalms and the Old Testament. And that gave him a lot of solace. And also, my son was born then. And so he came to a realization. And he didn't live long enough to basically, play that whole thing out. But he was incredibly hurt by what happened in Washington. And by the things that people said. And at that time, as you said, at that time, it's not just at that time.
It's interesting.
It's right now.
Yeah. In our firm, I mean, I'm not Jewish, so I can't really speak to the issue directly. But in the firm, I've been surrounded by Jewish partners and, colleagues, not Henry, but Ben Mendel. I worked for Ben Mendel for years. And Jim Cohen for decades. And although Jim was agnostic, pretty much. But assimilation was the goal, I think, in a lot of, I gather, I can't speak to this, but so there was this desire for assimilation and acceptance in the community. I think the only one story I can say to this issue with Henry, and it only comes translated through, I think, probably John Mesick, is that he struggled with, if I'm not mistaken, the Fort Orange Club. He was the first person, along with Al Hesper, to join. Right, but for years he wasn't welcome to join. He was the token. Right, that's what I'm saying. It was like I was asked to be a debutante, and I wouldn't do it. Right. Well, you know the story better than I. I know that there was a whole... No, he was... What would you say, Tom?
He was conflicted.
Yeah, right.
He was totally conflicted, about who he was.
Right.
Am I part of the establishment, and can I fit into the Fort Orange Club and the Albany Savings Bank and, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Or, am I a Jew?
Yeah. I got bits of that from being in the firm. And maybe I got it wrong, but...
Yeah, no, he was definitely searching for something.
Yeah. That dichotomy again, maybe, like you were saying.
No, I think that there was that doubleness about his architecture, about his personality, about his, his father, all those things. And I think our family had that kind of sometimes self-hatred. Very complicated.
I never got any of that from Ben or from Jim Cohen.
Ben was Mr.
He was a mensch. He was loved by everyone.
He was professional. Yeah. He was Mr. Temple Beth Emeth. My father wasn't at all. Sure. It's complicated.
But
interesting that you brought that up. No, I'm glad you did.
It stuck with me from when we were planning it. I had to make a point. So thank you. I think at this point we'd be designing for about a little over an hour. Do we want to start to tour around a little bit, stretch our legs after
Yeah, we're going to tour here.